Welcome to Reform Thinking, and welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take dense, complex sources, the kind that really form the bedrock of entire theological or philosophical movements, and we try to distill them. We turn them into clear, fascinating insight for you. Our focus today is, well, it's monumental. We're jumping right into the foundational thinking of the Reformed tradition. We're drawing from the opening pages of John Calvin's masterpiece, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. We're not looking at some small doctrinal point here. We're tackling the very first truth Calvin establishes, the idea that the knowledge of God has been naturally implanted in the minds of men. We have these short but extremely potent excerpts. Our mission is to peel back the layers on this concept, often called the sensus divinitatis, the sense of divinity. We need to figure out just how universal this knowledge is, why it's inescapable, and maybe the most compelling part, what happens, psychologically, existentially, when a person actively tries to ignore it, to suppress this basic truth. This is really the cornerstone of human culpability.
It really is. It's the single most critical starting point for understanding Reformed thought on humanity. We're looking at this innate, non-negotiable awareness of the divine that, according to the source, is native to the human species. If you get this one concept, you really get Calvin's entire framework for the relationship between the creator and the creature. The proposition itself is simple, but it's revolutionary. God has provided an inherent self-revising awareness of his divine majesty in the mind of every single human being. And this conviction, the sources insist, it doesn't wait for a sermon. It doesn't wait for a revelation in nature. It starts inside. It just is. And this leads us straight to the crucial high-stakes question we have to answer. If this knowledge is inescapable, what are the precise moral and psychological consequences when people actively choose to fight against it? As we're going to see, the source material argues that this innate knowledge establishes an undeniable standard. It makes human ignorance of God, in a fundamental sense, impossible, and that sets the stage for self-condemnation. So let's unpack the extraordinary detail here, starting with its character.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this central assertion about what this endowment is. The source makes a declaration of fact. It says, there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. It's not put out there as a hypothesis to be debated, is it? It's presented as an intrinsic design feature of the mind.
That is the key distinction. It's taken as a settled fact because the source traces it back to the active will of the creator. This isn't just human reason stumbling on a divine concept. It's a deliberate implanting by God himself. He has, and I'm quoting, implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty. What that means is you can't divorce the concept of a human mind from the concept of God's existence. The two are just woven together at the point of creation.
I think we need to slow down right here because this idea has some massive implications. If this is implanted, how is that different from what the sources elsewhere call general revelation? The knowledge we get from observing the world, the stars, nature. This seems like a critical distinction for anyone who follows these topics.
It's a vital point. And the source implicitly draws that distinction. We're dealing with two separate but related forms of knowledge. What's called creationis cognitio, the knowledge from creation that's external. It's objective. You perceive it through your senses. You look at the grandeur of the mountains and you infer a grand designer. That's general revelation.
Right.
But the sensus divinitatis, that's internal, it's subjective, it's instinctual. It's the built-in operating system that registers the existence of the divine before you even open your eyes to look at the sky. It's that awareness that I am a creature and I have a maker. This internal sense is what makes the external revelation meaningful at all. When the source talks about suppression, it's primarily talking about the psychological suppression of this internal sensus divinitatis.
And what's really fascinating about this innate knowledge is that the source doesn't treat it like a static, one-time factory setting. It's actively maintained. The source says God is ever renewing its memory. He repeatedly sheds fresh drops. That suggests this knowledge is constantly refreshed. It's sort of running in the background of your consciousness.
That constant refreshment is the engine of its inescapability. That's the key. If it were just a fleeting memory or some fragile intellectual concept, you could forget it. You could argue it away. But because God is actively shedding fresh drops, it means the knowledge is continuously present. It's always running in the background, a persistent intellectual and moral prompt. And because of this active, implanted, and renewed awareness, the source moves immediately to the very severe consequences. It says, since, therefore, men one and all perceive that there is a God and that he is their maker, they are condemned by their own testimony because they have failed to honor him and to consecrate their lives to his will.
Let's interrogate that consequence for a second. That is a very high standard. The source is saying that just knowing God exists and that he's your maker creates an immediate, non-negotiable moral obligation. The obligation to honor him and dedicate your life to his will. And if you fail to do that, you're condemned not by some external law, but by your own internal evidence. That seems radical.
It is. It's the foundation of theological ethics laid bare. The condemnation doesn't come from lacking information that was withheld from you. It comes from possessing information that was forced upon your conscience by creation itself, and then failing to act on the moral obligation that just flows naturally from that knowledge. If you know you have a creator, you inherently know you owe him worship and obedience. The standard is internal, it's fixed, and it's impossible to get away from because the knowledge is perpetually renewed in the mind. This is where the concept becomes so weighty. This knowledge forms what the source later calls the law of their creation, which we'll get into. But for now, you just have to recognize that the source views every human being as being born under a kind of moral contract, signed and verified by the sensus divinitatis. Any failure to live up to that contract is a violation based on internal, inescapable testimony.
And to prove this idea of universality, the source then turns to a kind of negative proof. It addresses the one place where you might expect ignorance to flourish among geographically isolated or, less advanced populations. It anticipates the modern anthropological objection. It says, if ignorance of God is to be looked for anywhere, surely one is most likely to find an example of it among the more backward folk and those more remote from civilization. Basically, if there are any non-religious cultures, they should be found in the deepest jungles or on the most remote islands.
And the source just refutes that claim instantly. It uses a very powerful rhetorical device. It appeals to outside, non-theological authority. It brings in a quotation from a pagan author, probably Cicero or Seneca, which is a very intentional move for the audience. The source notes, "Yet there is, as the eminent pagan says, no nation so barbarous, no people so savage, that they have not a deep-seated conviction that there is a God."
That's a huge point.
This citation is not trivial. Calvin is essentially saying, look, you don't have to take my theological word for it. Even the best minds of the non-Christian world philosophers who dedicated themselves to reason and observation, they testified to this universal human trait. It turns the claim from a theological assertion into an empirical observation backed by secular history and philosophy.
That makes the argument incredibly robust. If even the philosophers outside the Christian tradition confirm that a deep-seated conviction exists everywhere, that supports the idea that this conviction isn't taught, it's inherent, it's part of the human package.
And to explain the mechanism of this universal existence, the source gives us one of its most famous metaphors, the seed of religion, or semen religionis. Even people who seem least to differ from brutes, who lack complex civilization or external religious instruction, they still retain some seed of religion.
A seed.
And what's important here is that a seed isn't a finished flower. It's not a full-blown church service or a detailed systematic theology. It's an inherent tendency, an inclination, a starting point that has to be either nourished or suppressed. But the inclination itself, the common conception, it occupies and adheres tenaciously in all hearts. It is a constant fixture of the human condition.
So this is saying that the human condition is fundamentally religious in its impulse. The conviction itself is the proof of the implanting. And if this inherent awareness is present, as the sources claim, even in the most geographically isolated societies, then the idea that any person today could credibly claim to be genuinely, totally spiritually neutral, well, that's shattered.
It is.
The conviction is so potent that it shapes society itself. The source uses a striking claim about history, arguing that since the world's beginning, there's been no region, no city, and even no household that could do without religion. The very act of forming a stable, lasting human community seems to require an orientation toward the sacred.
That historical observation, the persistence of religion, it confirms the innate nature of the seed far beyond just individual psychology. If humans were naturally secular or prone to genuine atheism, the organization of society would reflect that, especially in times when state coercion was weak.
Right.
The fact that every attempt to organize human society always results in some form of religion, even if it's a corrupted or superstitious form, becomes what the source calls a tacit confession. It's proof that the internal sense of deity is so strong it has to externalize itself in corporate life. The source says this demonstrates the impossibility of genuine lasting atheism on a societal level. The impulse is just too strong to suppress collectively.
Okay, we've established that the knowledge is universal and inescapable.
Yeah.
But if man has this perfect, divinely implanted knowledge, Why is human history dominated by misdirected worship? Why do people universally invent false gods? This is the paradox the source addresses next, and it uses idolatry as a sort of backhanded confession of the truth. Why would man, a creature of inherent pride and self-elevation, willingly humble himself to worship inanimate objects? Why wood and stone?
The source approaches this through the lens of corrupted human pride. We know that human nature, fallen nature, does not willingly submit to anything outside itself. Human haughtiness resists submission. It wants to be the source of its own authority. Yet, in their desperate desire to fulfill the inward demand for divinity, humans do something illogical. They place objects that are clearly below them, wood, stone, animals above themselves. The motivation, according to the source, is crucial. Man prefers to worship wood and stone rather than to be thought of as having no God. This reveals a psychological hierarchy. The pressure exerted by the sensus divinitatis, the pressure to acknowledge a deity, is even greater than the natural innate impulse towards self-elevation and pride.
That is a fascinating insight into human nature. Idolatry, then, isn't evidence of a failure of the religious instinct, but evidence of its overwhelming strength. A strength so powerful it forces submission, even if that submission is tragically misdirected toward, base objects of human invention.
Precisely. The internal mechanism demands reverence, and if the human will rejects the true object of reverence, the mechanism will find any substitute, no matter how ridiculous, just to satisfy the internal demand. This action confirms that the pressure exerted by the conviction is internally irresistible. It verifies that a most vivid impression of a divine being exists, which is difficult to blot out.
I see.
And consider the psychological cost of this action. For a person to voluntarily submit to an idol, they have to consciously diminish themselves. The source says the natural disposition, that innate haughtiness, is dramatically altered. Man voluntarily sinks from his natural haughtiness to the very depths in order to honor God. That forced submission, even to a false object, is the ultimate verification of the power of the innate conviction.
But if the seed is so powerful, why is the corruption so prevalent? Doesn't the sheer volume of misdirected worship undercut the efficacy of the original implanting? The knowledge is clear, yet the action is confused.
The source understands this conflict. It attributes the corruption not to the failure of the original implanting, but to human depravity and the immediate tendency to corrupt good things. The sensus divinitatis is perfect as implanted, but the human mind is a factory of idols. The knowledge itself isn't extinguished, but it is instantly corrupted, distorted, and directed toward the self-serving rather than the truthful. Idolatry proves the existence of the seed, depravity explains its corruption.
Okay, let's pivot to the second major counter-argument the source tackles. This is a philosophical challenge that dates back to antiquity. This is the claim that religion was entirely fabricated by the subtlety and craft of clever men. The ancient idea that rulers, priests, or philosophers invented faith simply to control the masses through fear and awe.
The source dismisses this argument as utterly vain, but it provides a very careful, nuanced refutation, showing a lot of theological sobriety. Calvin acknowledges that there is a partial truth here. He says, "Clever men have devised very many things in religion by which to inspire the common folk with reverence and to strike them with terror." Manipulation of existing faith structures, that happens constantly throughout history.
Of course.
However, the source argues these clever manipulators could never have succeeded in the first place if men's minds were not already been imbued with a firm conviction about God. The inclination toward religion springs from this conviction as from a seed. Manipulation requires something pre-existing to manipulate.
So the argument is that the crafty men are only gardening. They're not manufacturing the scene itself. If the religious instinct weren't already fixed and demanding satisfaction, the clever tricks, the fear-mongering, the ritualistic, all that would fall flat. It would be entirely unconvincing.
Exactly. The pre-existing inclination is the necessary precondition for successful manipulation. If the populace had no inherent spiritual demand, no terror of the divine, the inventors of religion would have simply been laughed out of the public square. The fact that their manipulations worked proves that the sensus divinitatis was already there, active in craving direction. The clever men simply co-opted that innate desire.
This also challenges the true nature of the manipulators themselves. The source notes a final paradox. It is not credible that those who craftily impose religion on others were themselves entirely devoid of the knowledge of God.
That's a powerful internal challenge to the atheist philosopher. To successfully manipulate others through religion, you have to understand its power. And to understand its power, you must have felt the pressure of the innate conviction yourself. The source suggests that even the greatest skeptic or the most cynical ruler cannot genuinely claim complete, total ignorance of the divine. They may suppress it, they may exploit it, but they must first recognize the deep, visceral chord they are attempting to strike within the common person.
So if the architects of atheism or skepticism themselves secretly harbor the conviction they deny, even if it's only in the form of recognizing its manipulative power, then the idea of a truly conscious, total philosophical atheism, according to the source, is seriously compromised.
It shifts the entire conversation. If you encounter someone who claims complete disbelief, the source suggests you're not dealing with a blank slate. You're dealing with an intense internal psychological conflict. You're dealing with someone who is actively and desperately fighting against what they know to be fixed in their own mind, which leads us directly to the psychological consequences of that struggle.
Okay, let's move from the intellectual fight to the psychological battlefield. If this knowledge is so ingrained, how does the source demonstrate its existence in those who actively strive to deny it? We turn now to the psychological proof, the experience of those who aggressively reject God.
The source provides a classic historical case study to anchor this idea. Gaius Caligula, the Roman emperor, he was known for his tyrannical excesses and, crucially, for his attempts at self-deification and open mockery of the gods. He is presented as the historical archetype, bursting forth into bolder or more unbridled contempt of deity than anyone. He represents the person who tried to live above the demands of the divine.
But the contradiction in Caligula's life is where the source finds its validation. He was the most contemptuous publicly yet. He trembled more miserably when any sign of God's wrath manifested itself. He mocked the gods during the day, but ran for cover during a thunderstorm.
That gap between his conscious will and his involuntary reaction is the evidence. Caligula was forced, albeit unwillingly, to shudder at the God whom he professedly sought to despise. His willed rejection was violently, involuntarily overridden by his gut reaction to divine manifestation. The sensus divinitatis did not disappear. It struck him with renewed force at the precise moment he was trying to ignore it. It is the perfect illustration of suppression failing under pressure.
That brings a critical question to the forefront, though. The source claims atheism is impossible, that's fixed in the marrow. But we certainly observe people who claim to be determined, lifelong atheists, often rationalizing their position through science or philosophy. How does the source account for a dedicated, rational non-believer? Are they just hiding their shuddering?
According to this material, yes, they are hiding their shuddering, or maybe, more accurately, they're rationalizing their internal disquiet. The source argues that these intellectual shields, the philosophies, the sophisticated arguments, are themselves attempts at subterfuge. They are intellectual defense mechanisms created to prevent the conscience from striking. The goal isn't truth. The goal is spiritual peace achieved by extinguishing the knowledge. But the knowledge, because it is actively maintained by God, cannot be extinguished.
I see.
The source extends the Caligula case to the general population of defiant deniers. It uses a specific unsettling analogy drawn from Scripture. It says the boldest despiser of God is the most startled at the rustle of a falling leaf. This reference to Leviticus illustrates the utter psychological fragility of the godless person. Fear overtakes them for the smallest, most insignificant reason.
That suggests that suppressing this innate knowledge doesn't lead to confidence or peace, but to, well, neurosis and intense anxiety. If you've rejected the ultimate source of spiritual stability, then every minor threat, every unexpected sound becomes magnified because there is no ultimate framework to hold reality together for you.
Precisely. This extreme fear arises from the vengeance of divine majesty, which strikes their consciences all the more violently the more they try to flee from it. The source describes the consciousness of God as an active force, one that defends itself against human attempts at suppression. The conscience becomes the operational battlefield. The harder they push down the truth, the greater the pressure builds, making the inevitable spiritual blow that much more painful when it returns. The impious seek every subterfuge to hide themselves from the knowledge of the Creator and to efface it again from their minds. This is a continuous, desperate psychological struggle. They are trying to edit their own operating system, but the programming keeps reverting to default because of the constant renewal.
And the source makes it clear that this effort is fundamentally futile. They are always entrapped. If the awareness vanishes for a moment, through distraction, pleasure, or intellectual argument, it returns at once and rushes in with new force. It's an existential game of whack-a-mole they can never win because the awareness isn't external, it's internal.
And their attempt to find genuine peace through denial is then compared to a very specific and very vivid type of corrupted rest. The source likens any respite from anxiety of conscience to the sleep of drunken or frenzied persons who do not rest peacefully even while sleeping because they are continually troubled with dire and dreadful dreams.
That analogy paints a picture of agitation, even during what should be total rest. The drunken or frenzied person might achieve temporary physical unconsciousness or a temporary intellectual distraction. But the internal disquiet of their mind, the persistent knowledge they try to escape, prevents true rest. The internal storm never ceases.
True peace, according to this analysis, is impossible because the source of the disquiet, the innate knowledge of God, cannot be eradicated. It's part of the original design. The conclusion on godlessness, therefore, is firm. Actual godlessness is impossible. The frantic, perpetual struggle of the impious, who struggle furiously to remove this awareness, is the ultimate proof that this conviction is fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow.
That phrase, fixed deep within, as it were, in the very marrow, transforms the idea from a philosophical concept into something almost physiological. It's physically and mentally integral to who they are as created beings.
Yes, it is.
And the final visceral image the source uses here really brings the physical and moral pain home. The worm of conscience, described as sharper than any cauterizing iron, gnaws away within. This isn't just a metaphor for guilt. It's a terrifying image of unrelenting, constant, internal, corrosive pain that results from suppressing natural knowledge.
That worm is the active knowledge of God turning against the host that seeks to destroy it. It shows that denying a core part of your created being results not just in anxiety, but in perpetual, agonizing guilt. If the knowledge of God is the light designed to guide us, suppressing it turns that light inward, burning the vessel that holds it. It is a state of perpetual moral injury.
Let's use this profound psychological insight to bridge to the final necessary point, which connects this innate knowledge back to human purpose. If we are born with this fixed knowledge, what is the ultimate moral conclusion drawn about humanity's existence? What is the fundamental law of creation?
Right.
The source states clearly, if all men are born and live to the end that they may know God, and yet if knowledge of God is unstable and fleeting unless it progresses to this degree, it is clear that all those who do not direct every thought and action in their lives to this goal degenerate from the law of their creation.
This is the culmination of the argument. The existence of the sensus divinitatis is not just a point of fact. It creates an immediate, defining obligation. Our knowledge of God is the single intended goal of human existence. If we fail to direct every thought and action toward this goal, the consequence isn't just a moral failing, it is a metaphysical degeneration. We move away from the intended blueprint of what it means to be human.
Degeneration.
To degenerate means to fall below the standard of your species. If the standard of the human species is the knowledge and worship of God, then anything less than that is a reversion to something lower. We become spiritually deficient, acting contrary to the very reason we were created.
The source isn't content to leave this as a purely theological proposition either. It connects this idea of purpose to classical philosophical thought, suggesting this is a universal truth recognized even by those who lacked the full revelation of Scripture. It invokes Plato here. It states that Plato meant nothing different when he taught that the highest good of the soul is likeness to God. This likeness is achieved when the soul grasps the knowledge of God and is wholly transformed into his likeness. Knowledge of God is, therefore, the mechanism of human flourishing and perfection.
It is the ultimate alignment. To know God is to align your nature with the divine standard, achieving the highest possible state of human existence. To fail to know him is to remain misaligned and fractured. The source uses this philosophical alignment to show that the Creator's law of creation is a universal truth, not just a sectarian one. And we also have the particularly powerful citation of Plutarch's argument, specifically referencing the dialogue Gryllus. This is where the source makes its most direct comparison between the godless person and a brute. Plutarch's argument affirms that without religion, men are in no wise superior to brute beasts, but are actually far more miserable.
Why more miserable? If we degenerate to the level of animals, why aren't we simply content like animals? Animals lack the sensus divinitatis.
That is the tragic difference. A brute beast lives according to its nature without the internal contradiction. It doesn't have the worm of conscience. Man, however, attempts to live without religion while still possessing the inescapable sensus divinitatis and the moral obligation that comes with it.
I see.
The godless person is described as subject to so many forms of wickedness, dragging out their lives in ceaseless tumult and disquiet. They have the moral capacity and internal promptings of humanity, but they are living a life intended for brutes. The result is constant dissatisfaction, agitation, and directionlessness. The internal conflict creates the misery that the animal, lacking that higher sense, avoids entirely.
The conclusion is therefore clear and uncompromising. It is the worship of God alone that renders men higher than the brutes. It is only through this worship, fueled by the innate knowledge, that they aspire to immortality and fulfill the design built into them. The innate knowledge gives them the capability, and the redirection of life toward God fulfills the creation law, elevating them beyond mere animality and toward their highest purpose.
That's it.
So we have completed the full trajectory of the argument. We started with the innate universal endowment, the sensus divinitatis, which is fixed deep in the mind and constantly refreshed. We saw how this truth is confirmed even through its corruption, since idolatry proves the strength of the divine impression. And finally, we analyzed the severe psychological consequences of suppressing this truth, leading to ceaseless tumult and a state of degeneration, as we saw with figures like Caligula.
Absolutely. The theological analysis shows that since the knowledge is implanted and self-revising, there is no valid excuse for neglecting one's duty to the Creator. And the psychological analysis provides the vivid, practical consequence. Striving to suppress or ignore this innate knowledge leads not to intellectual freedom or peace, but only to misery, anxiety, and a state below the intended design for humanity. This analysis, it changes the landscape of human interaction. The source states that although the world tries to cast away all knowledge of God, the sense of divinity thrives and presently burgeons through the actions of conscience. So, if the knowledge of God is something fixed in the very marrow and learned from the mother's womb, how does this change the framework for discussing faith or addressing those who claim disbelief?
It suggests that the discussion is never about introducing a new idea to a neutral party. Instead, it is always about confronting an existing, deeply personal conviction that has been actively and painfully suppressed. It means that when you speak of God, you are never teaching something wholly foreign. You are tapping into a design feature that is already screaming for attention beneath the layers of denial and distraction. That is a truly different starting point for any conversation about life and purpose.